Hello, my name is Jonathan Wyner. Welcome to another episode of Are You Listening? Today I want to talk to you a little bit about references and how to use references, how to identify good quality references for you in your mastering work. So, about references. The criteria for references in mastering, I think, is a little bit different from mixing. You could make an argument that in order to judge the relative balance and the use of effects and to think about the kinds of things that you're thinking about when you're mixing, you could use a wide variety of references in terms of quality and the sources that they came from. In mastering, it's a little bit different. The notion of fidelity becomes a much bigger deal, and by fidelity, I don't just mean like the golden ears sort of things that only the most sort of critical listeners are listening for. But ultimately, what you want to do is to be able to accurately compare your work to what's out in the world, to your favorite recordings, or the things that you admire, or the things that define the genres within which you're working. And so in order to do that, you need to be able to hear as closely as possible the audio in the same fashion, in the same form as it came off the mastering desk, not changed by a distribution service, not changed by cutting it to vinyl, putting it on cassette tape, MP3, what have you. That's a challenge. Many of the streaming services, many of the suppliers of audio that we listen to modify the audio in a way to make it a better experience for us as consumers. But in making those changes, sometimes they will change some essential components of the sound that we're hearing that make it hard for us to really compare what we're doing against the mastered version or the master. So the first thing you want to do is figure out whether what you're hearing has been loudness normalized. Loudness normalization, to give a very quick definition, is it's not unlike what happens when music is played over the radio. Actually, it's far more benign than what happens when it's played over the radio, but the idea is basically the same, which is the playback services, when they loudness normalize the material, want to make sure that you can go from song 1 to song 2 to song 3 and have the playback level be more or less consistent. You may notice some variations depending on how much energy there is in the low end or the high end or how much compression there is. But in general, with loudness normalization on, you won't get gross differences in terms of level. Simply in doing that, by changing the level, if you use that as a reference for your mastering work, you're not really comparing it to the level of the master. You're comparing it to the level of what's distributed. So right there, we've got a little bit of a disconnect. When you are comparing to a reference, you want to make sure you have loudness normalization turned off for your enjoyment, and maybe also to understand what ultimately is going to happen to your master after you're done with it. It's also interesting to listen with loudness normalization turned on, but I just want to make sure you're aware of this difference. Getting a little bit more into the nuances and the subtleties of references, the quality of the audio that you're listening to also can make a difference. When you listen to lossy audio, and I'm talking about MP3, AAC, Ogg Vorbis, all of the different codecs that are used by the major distribution services, and they do this so that it's easier for your listeners to hear your music, there are some artifacts that you hear. They may not present as really obvious, but they do change the overall tone of what you're listening to. If you compare your work against something that's distorted, and it's therefore altered the tone, and you try to match that, well, you can probably already understand what the problem with that is. You're using as a target something that's already skewed, and then if your work goes out to whatever distribution service you like to use, or you will use, and that tone gets skewed once again, you've kind of doubled up the artifact, if you will, or doubled up that tonal shift. Let me show you a way by looking at the spectrogram that you can identify whether or not you're listening to something that is lossy. So I'm going to play a track, and this is a WAV file, full resolution WAV file. And I am going to turn on the codec preview within Ozone and hit play. And right behind it, I've got another instance of the equalizer so we can look at the spectrum. I'll bypass the codec at first. And here you see energy all the way across the spectrum. Watch what happens when I turn on the codec preview. You'll notice that it looks like we've lost all of the energy in the recording above about 15,000 hertz, and in fact we have. This is one of the artifacts, if you will, part of the processing that's required to reduce the bandwidth of the signal that we're looking to encode and allow us to use fewer bits. If I change the bit rate of the codec, you'll notice that the low-pass filter rises a little bit. If I go from 128 kilobits per second to 192, you'll see we get information a little bit higher up and a little bit higher up. And at 320 kilobits per second, it's almost impossible to see, but you can still see a little bit of the artifact of that filter. So this is a quick way of checking a file that you might be listening to and understanding whether or not it had ever been a lossy file or gone through a lossy codec. You should remember it's possible if you're working with beats, for instance, and somebody has sent you some beats and you've layered vocals on top, and those beats were an MP3 or an AAC, the signature of the lossy codec just in the beats may show up on the display. So, think about that a little bit harder when you think about trying to decide whether or not you're actually dealing with a good quality reference or whether it's just something that's baked into the music. That's a visual prompt that can help you understand whether or not your reference is lossy. But there's also a sonic artifact to having gone through a lossy encoder. So I'm going to let you hear that, and I'm going to exaggerate it by playing back this audio. Again, 128 kilobits per second MP3, and I'm going to let you listen first to the output of the codec. This is basically A minus B, the original file, with the resulting MP3 flipped out of phase and subtracted from the original file. And what you're going to hear is everything that was thrown away by the codec, and you're also going to hear something that sounds like distortion. And in fact, it is distortion. When we run signals through lossy codecs, we end up with a fair bit of noise that comes from all of the filtering that's required in order to reduce the file size. Keep in mind, everything that we're going to hear in the artifact, according to the psychoacoustic model, is largely masked by the codec. Nonetheless, let me let you listen to what that sounds like. I'll start with it off, and then I'm going to turn it on.
It's too long, we're too dark, but we got fast and turned. Can't find the silence, spilled coffee. Silver line to get me by.
Now that sounds horrible. You wouldn't obviously want that in your music. As I said, most of that is masked, but there's a little way in which that distortion component in the audio does influence the sound of your mix or your master. So now, instead of soloing the artifact, I'm going to turn the codec on and then off again, and I want you to focus on the sibilants, like the S's and the T's, the hi-hats, the top of the snare drum, anything that's in the high frequency region, because that's where the most obvious accent comes in when you listen through a lossy codec.
Under pressure, it's too long, we're too dark, but we got fast and turned. Can't find the silence, spilled coffee, look at me spiral. No seat on the metro ride. I just need a small victory, a silver line to get me by. I just need a win, a neon sign, an arrow shot, a tunnel light. I just need a win.
It's amazing that we're able to reduce the file sizes to the extent that we are using lossy codecs. In this case, we're gaining, I should say, about 90% efficiency We're going from a file size of something around 30 megabytes down to about 3 megabytes, and still hearing something that sounds very much like the song, but it's changed subtly. And we're talking about references. We're talking about you finessing and making the fine decisions and fine changes that you want to make your recording sound as good as possible. We don't necessarily want to be hearing it with that distortion, with that accent in the high end. So that's why I'm encouraging you to seek out something that hasn't been lossy, or at the very least is a very high resolution lossy file using 256 or 320 kilobits per second. I work pretty hard to find references that are going to work for me and make sure that whatever I'm working from is as high quality as possible. I've been lucky enough actually to be able to get some files directly from friends who will share them with me, obviously with the permission of artists, so I can have those in my file folder. I do go out and buy used CDs, find them wherever I can. Certainly big name artists are still making CDs, objects that they can sell at shows and so on. Or I'm downloading files directly from the high quality versions of the streaming services that are out there. And there seem to be more and more of them coming online as time goes on. And I think that's good news, certainly for me as a mastering engineer and for you as a mastering engineer and music producer who's aspiring to make your stuff as good as possible. So the value of references is to help us understand, generally speaking, something about the level and the tone of the tracks that we're working on compared to what's out there. I think you have to be careful not to interpret references too literally. If you're trying to do a sound-alike record, if you want your record to sound just like Bruno Mars or just like, whoever your favorite artist is, then maybe you want to mimic that as closely as possible. But most of us are trying to do something that expresses something that we want to express, that's unique about our artists or ourselves, and still have it compare well or fit into the expectations, the experience, the common practices, however you want to put it, of the listening audience. And so you want, I think, to generalize some idea of references. For my money, I rather than using a single favorite record as a reference when I'm working in a genre, I'll look for a collection of material. And from that collection of material, I can distill some general ideas about it. Let me show you one way of using the matching EQ tool that's in Ozone to kind of generalize this idea. So within Ozone, there is a module that's dedicated to the task of matching EQ. I'm going to set this up and give it a chance to learn the signature of what I'll consider to be my source track, and then, or the track that I'm working on. And then I'm going to have it learn the target spectrum of a track that I want it to sound like. And let's see what happens. So a quick capture here.
We're so impressive and we're so under pressure. It's too long, we're too dark, but we got fast and turning. Can't find it, the silence spilled coffee.
You want to make sure while you're playing the audio that you give it enough of the mix so that it can capture an average. If you stick to just one small section of the audio, the average spectrum may be weighted more towards a particular chord, a tonal center, a note, a density of the arrangement. But after about 30 or 40 seconds, you'll get a pretty good sense of the overall spectrum of the track.
I just need it.
So now we see the spectrum that's up in the module, and I am going to capture the spectrum of another track. I've loaded the spectrum of a target track, something that I want that track to sound like, into my matching EQ tool. And now I can use the sliders in the right lower hand quadrant to tell the tool how much I want these two to sound alike. Now, if I go for the full amount of match and don't smooth the results, you can see that it's created an EQ, or a matching curve, that's kind of crazy, because it's trying to make this song sound exactly like the spectrum of the other song, which doesn't really make sense. These are different songs. They have different tonal centers, they have slightly different arrangements, different instrumentation. And so I'm going to smooth the matching curve while I'm listening until I get an imprint, a change in the EQ that's flattering to the master that I'm working on. And you can see that the difference between these two is that there's a little less low end, there's a little more low mid-range, there's a little less right around 1K, and a presence increase, energy up around 2 and 4,000 hertz. That's really helpful and really interesting. By using the smoothing function, I can generalize the change that I'm trying to make, rather than trying to make my mastered track sound exactly like the target track. A couple of tips when you are preparing to try to match one track to another. If you're using a commercial track that's made by your favorite artist, I'd encourage you to take the level of that track, at least initially, take it down a couple of dB, so that you don't try to make up the level all at once before you've started to try to finesse the mastering adjustments you're going to make. If you try to make up the level all at once, you may find yourself pushing a limiter too hard, getting too involved with level before you start thinking about tone and tonal balance. When you are applying something like a match EQ, it's a good idea to make sure that you leave yourself some headroom so that you're not driving the level all the way up and then EQing on top of that, because some distortion will result in that case. So all of that is to say, small increments, don't try to make up all the level all at a time, to give yourself some room as you're trying to match your track to your reference track. Another way of understanding a general sense of spectrum and reference is using tonal balance control. This is a tool that can show you spectrum that's averaged over many thousands of recordings in different genres that you can use to measure your audio against. Let's take a look at the screen here. And within tonal balance control, you can see a list of lots and lots of different genres and the resulting spectral shape. As I said, this is averaged over thousands and thousands and thousands of tracks. So if I were to take the song that I'm listening to here, I'll pull up the pop spectrum, hit play.
The silence, spilled coffee, look at me spiral. No seat on the metro ride. I just need a
As I'm comparing it against typical spectrum across pop records, I can see that I'm pretty much in bounds there. There's a little difference in the very top end, maybe a little accent around 10,000 hertz, a little deficit up above 18K. You know, I might think about making an adjustment there. I see a little dip around 500 hertz, maybe even a little dip around 180 and a little bump around 50. So if I was so inclined, I could pull up my EQ from Ozone and experiment with making some adjustments to address that and see if I think that it gets better by bringing it in line with what is defined as a pop spectrum.
tears, 'cause I don't really do much.
So tonal balance control is a great way of helping you gauge your music compared to this average spectrum. And that's really helpful, because if there's something that's out of bounds, at least you can think about it. At least you can decide, am I making this creative decision that's causing my music to be different and I'm happy about it? Or, oh, gee, yes, I do have too much top end and it's making everything a little bit too bright. I'll bring it down, in that instance, a tool like this is a really, really helpful reference for you to use. When I come into my room to first start working on a track, I will actually put up some references in my monitors and listen a little bit as I'm setting up, just to kind of recalibrate myself to my environment. And if I know the references and I know my playback system, that gets me into the right headspace. So already I've created a little bit of a sense of a reference in my environment. Then I will listen to the track that I'm about to work on and listen for balance issues, listen for dynamics issues. I'll spend a little time thinking about that track just for itself. If there's any subtractive EQ or resonances that I want to pull out, I'll address those things and then stop and start to consider, generally speaking, is there a global or broad change that I need to make in order to move this in the direction that I want to move it, using references as a way to guide me. The reason that I won't get more than about 50 or 60% of the way through my processing before I do that is that if I notice that there's a big change that the reference suggests, that's going to make me rethink and change some of the other decisions that I've already made. So if I'm going to use a reference, I will bring that in pretty early into the process. Think about, generally speaking, is there a tonal change that I want to make? And then once I've figured that out, I will let that tonal shift that I want to use live in my mastering chain, and then I'll move on from there. And I probably won't do a lot of referencing after that, really for the idea that I'm trying to make my track sound like my track the best that it can. And I'll wind in the idea of the reference along the way to influence my work, but I don't really ultimately want that to determine the outcome of my work. The idea of a reference for a mastering engineer contains lots and lots of different ideas within it. I've curated a playlist that'll take you through several examples of what I think are excellent references in a few different genres. A great reference for me is music that I like, music where I appreciate the craft, music where there's a beautiful arrangement which is manifest in a beautiful mix and a beautiful master. And how do I know that that's the case? Well, here's just one way to think about it. When you're listening to a great mix and a great master, not only are you enjoying the music, but if there's any element in the arrangement that you want to hear, that you want to find with your ear, that you can. There's no sense of anything being obscured. Everything is available to the listener, but in proper proportion. So the vocal, the kick, the bass, the snare drum, they're front and center. But if I want to really sort of lose myself in the reverb that's present in an ambient track, I can do so. That may be a little abstracted, but that's one of the things that I notice that's a hallmark of a great reference. And that speaks not just to the greatness of the production and the music itself, but also the fidelity, also the quality of the recording. And for me, if all of those things are at play, that's when I'm happiest listening to music. So I hope that's helpful, and I hope it helps you think about curating your own set of references. You'll find lots of different examples in different genres of music that are the shining examples, the things that you aspire to make your recording sound like. One thing that I think would be fun and interesting is if you take those examples and put them in the comments section of this video. I'll be watching for them, and I'd love to find out some of the things that you're finding interesting and your best references. One of the things I enjoy most about teaching at school is that my students bring me music to listen to all the time, and I get exposed to new and great sounding records. So please feel free to do so. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I once again invite you to subscribe to this and look at the Spotify and listen to the Spotify playlist. And I look forward to seeing you for the next episode of Are You Listening?